Here we're going to look at the Mengzi. Mengzi was one of the most influential Confucian philosophers, someone who has argued that human nature is inherently good, someone who, as opposed to another Confucian philosopher, Shunzi. Mengzi wrote on many things, the most important, his political and ethical philosophy, which we'll be taking a look at kind of the foundation of his political and ethical philosophy here in this video lecture. Now, Mengzi is also, spelled Mengzis or Mengzi, depending on the kind of script that is used. And he lived 322 to 289 BCE. Now, Mengzi argued that the ruler of a state, right, so the king, should rule according to benevolence and righteousness, right? They should rule according to wanting to do what is morally the correct thing to do, not merely what is profitable to the state. Or another way of thinking about what he meant when he said that, a ruler doing what is profitable to the state is what is consequential to the state, right? So the question is, should a ruler either do what is going to bring out the best consequences for the state, right? Focusing on it's best for me to maintain my power by jailing some enemies or things like that, right? Or should the ruler focus on doing what is the morally correct thing to do, even if in the immediate term, right, it doesn't seem that it's actually going to bring about the best consequences for the ruler in the moment. Mengzi says, "If your majesty says, 'How can I profit my state?' the chief counselors will say, 'How can I profit my clan?' And the nobles and commoners will say, 'How can I profit myself?' Superiors and subordinates will seize profit from each other, and the state will be endangered." Now, this is what's really interesting here that Mengzi is arguing is, look, if you're a ruler and you do want to bring about the best consequences for the state, right? And so you always think in terms of what's profitable for me as a ruler, and I, as a ruler as the king and the de facto, state, the sovereign. What's really interesting about that is that logic then can be applied to others. If we're going to say what matters is just what is profitable, you should always do whatever is profitable, well, so too will others think the same. So the ruler might think, well, such and such is profitable to me, and doing that could be profitable to them. But the chief counselors might think, okay, then what's profitable to me? And then they try to act on what is profitable to them. Of course, the problem is what might be profitable to them might not be profitable, of course, to the state. And then, of course, that can be the case for every other individual as well. If every individual is seeking what they think is profitable for themselves, right, what's going to bring out the best consequences for them, then people are going to be doing, many different things. If profit or consequences govern the actions of the ruler of a state, Mengzi is arguing here that chaos would result, undermining the state ultimately, right? Actually not then being what is the most profitable for the state, because others are also going to seek what's profitable for them. And this is going to, cause a conflict and tension. On the other hand, if righteousness and benevolence govern the actions of the ruler of a state, then all various factions will be dealt with according to a harmony that results in justice as well as profit, right? So if instead the ruler thinks, okay, what is, how can I rule in a benevolent way or rule righteously? Well, then the ruler is going to think, okay, what is the best thing to do in ways in which I should act towards my chief counselors? How should I act towards the people? In this way, the ruler is going to be incorporating everyone into the decision-making of the state and into the decision-making of what the ruler should ultimately do. The goal, hopefully, then, is to act in such a way that harmony results, right? If we act benevolently and righteously, what should result is harmony. It should be based on harmony. What results then from that harmony is justice, and that is actually what's going to bring about the best consequences. So there's almost a kind of paradox here. If you want to bring about the best consequences, you can't act on the basis of consequences. You act on the basis of benevolence and righteousness. Now, the first question of politics is that of security and peace. So the first question any ruler needs to deal with, or any philosopher also needs to think about, is how to secure the populace, how to ensure there's not chaos, there's not fighting, right? Because if you don't do that, even if you think justice is the most important thing, you can't pursue justice if you don't have security and peace, if you don't have some kind of mutual trust among the citizens such that you can have cooperation. Now, one approach to this was legalism. So legalism became the dominant philosophy out of the warring states, right? This was a period where you had a multitude of factions in ancient China, wherein you had just constant turmoil, right? You have one ruler in charge, then they're overthrown by someone else. There's no long-term stability by any of the governments. So what legalism said is, look, if you want to achieve security and peace, you do this by keeping people in line through fear, right? You don't try to act in a loving way towards your populace. You act out of fear. If you act out of fear, people, of course, are going to be afraid to commit crimes. They're going to be afraid to act in violence, act immorally, because they could be punished, right? So punishment then is the deterrence. Now, Mengzi says that instead of this, good governance, right, is necessary to facilitate the practice of the virtues. That the purpose of government is to facilitate morality, to make it possible for people to act moral. You achieve this not by keeping people in line through fear, because if you do so, you're not going to be acting benevolently and righteously towards your subjects. What you need to do in order to facilitate, right, if you think of government as that entity which is in charge of ensuring that people cooperate in such a way that it makes possible for people to practice the virtues and to live a moral life, right, for people to flourish morally, then what you need to do is create a structure which is the conditions for the possibility of morality. So the flourishing of other conditions beyond physical violence, right, through war or punishment, is necessary for peace and security. So if you want to achieve peace and security, you have to focus on facilitating the practice of the virtues. As Mengzi says, when grain, fish, turtles, and wood are inexhaustible, this will make the people have no regrets for caring for the living or mourning the dead. When the people have no regrets about caring for the living or mourning the dead, it is the beginning of the kingly way. So what he means here is that, look, if you have an abundance of resources, okay? If you have an abundance of resources, you're less likely for people to act violently or to act immorally towards others because, maybe they're starving, so they think they have to go steal from someone else. Or maybe because there's no real job security, right? People resort to gang violence or whatever else, which destabilizes society and makes it more likely for people to act in immoral ways and act in ways that might undermine the dominance of the state. So if instead you focus on how can I best meet the needs of the people, then you make it possible for people to be able to focus on acting in a moral way because they don't have to worry about committing crimes, or they're not tempted even to commit crimes because it wouldn't be fruitful. Because instead, right, people don't have to worry about whether or not someone else is going to come and pillage the town. And I should say here, what's really interesting about this is that Mengzi is making, in a way, an argument about certain background conditions that are needed. That you can't just have people act morally. You need certain structural conditions in place that facilitate the ability for people to act morally. Now, qi is that kind of physical medium, right, through which one's emotions and personal character are manifested. Now, they can be manifested in a bad way or a good way. So, cultivating virtue, then, begins with cultivating one's qi. One's qi is that kind of, again, the physical medium which connects oneself to their environment and to everyone else then that operates in that environment. So to preserve one's chi then is to control one's emotions, to construct an environment in such a way that one is not tempted to lash out in anger, right? Controls one's emotions ultimately such that then they can use reason. And if you can use reason, you can think about what is the right thing for me to do in this moment, right? What is the virtuous thing to do here? Instead of merely what feels good, right? I'm only maybe merely thinking about bringing about pleasure, and so I act on that. No, instead, if chi has been cultivated successfully, then, right, I have the necessary environment that provide the conditions for the possibility of acting morally. So virtue is attained wherein the will and one's chi are in harmony. Mengzi says, your will is the commander of the chi. Chi fills the body. When your will is fixed somewhere, the chi sets up camp there. Hence, it is said, maintain your will, do not injure the chi. When your will is unified, it moves the chi. When the chi is unified, it moves your will. Now, running and stumbling have to do with the chi, but nonetheless, they perturb one's heart. So on the one hand, you of course need a certain amount of will to seek to structure a better environment, to cultivate better relationships with others, right? So it's important that in part of your chi is having good friends, friends which are moral and which are not going to tempt you to do immoral things, to have a close family, a family you can rely on that provides a moral support for yourself. You need, of course, a certain kind of livelihood that provides means of subsistence, and so on, right? So, on the one hand, though, it's of course not good enough just to have the good environment. You have to then, well, so the chi provides, again, the conditions for the possibility, but it doesn't mean it is the cause. It is just the conditions for the possibility. It makes it possible for you to act moral. But what you need then is a will. But again, a will is not just good enough. If you have a good will, well, this can be corrupted, of course, by bad chi. If you have bad friends, then even if you're a good person, over time, they're going to wear on you. They're going to tempt you into doing bad things where bad habits will form. So you need a certain harmony where both your will and your chi go hand in hand to enable you to act virtuously. So again, it's not just good enough that you can sit in an armchair and think and meditate on being good. And it's not just good enough that you have a good environment. You need to work on cultivating both. Now, although this, in many ways, is pretty abstract and generalized in the ways in which we want to seek the conditions for the possibility of living a virtuous life, as Mengzi is arguing, Mengzi also is able to apply his theory in specific ways, right? So an example of this is where Mengzi said, if one respects the worthy, employs the capable, and puts the outstanding in office, then the nobles of the world will be pleased and will wish to take their place in your court. If one taxes the shops in one's markets, but not their goods, or regulates them but does not tax the shops or their goods, then the merchants of the world will all be pleased and will wish to store goods in one's markets. If one's customs officers inspect but do not tax, then the travelers of the world will be pleased and will wish to go out on your road. If those who plow must provide assistance but are not taxed, then the farmers of the world will be pleased and will wish to plow your fields. If shopholders need not pay the personal or village surtax, then the people of the world will be pleased and will be willing to be one's subjects. If one is truly capable of putting into effect these 5 things, then the people of neighboring states will welcome you like a father or mother. Right? So the ways in which then taxation can be used to facilitate ways in which people realize, hey, I can better myself, right? I can fulfill my wishes in your domain as opposed to the rule of someone else. And they will want to move to your living under your reign. They will see that their livelihood, the prospects of their livelihood are better because you have created such a structure that it facilitates a sense of well-being, as well as, of course, the ability to morally flourish, right? And there are different ways one can approach this, but here, as Mengzi is pointing out, right, you don't just want to have, like, for example, a blanket tax on everyone. Maybe if you set up taxes in a certain way where it facilitates certain actions, right, then government can be used to facilitate people to act morally. Because again, the purpose of government is to enable people to act morally, right? I mean, this differs from modern liberal political theory, for example, where the purpose of government is not to facilitate morality. It is merely to protect natural rights, like, for example, life, liberty, and property. Right? So this argument is not about rights, it's about morality. And the idea is, of course, maybe rights could be important, although this concept of rights did not exist then. But the point is, what good are rights if people aren't able to live in a moral way, right? Okay, maybe the government protects your natural rights, but if people are acting immorally, what kind of a society is that? Would you want to live in a society where everyone is criminals, even if somehow your rights are protected? So maybe in that scenario, people are constantly being jailed, and in that way, your rights are being protected. But it doesn't seem like a kind of society that many would want to live in, right? So in this way, morality would trump rights. So Mengzi thinks that human beings are naturally predisposed to have a sense of compassion. So they're predisposed to be benevolent. Now, this doesn't mean all humans act benevolently, but it means we all have the capacity, and we all have this kind of innate inclination towards benevolence. Now, there's an opposing view known as egoism. So egoism argues that all humans do good things for ultimately unconscious, selfish reasons. So maybe I see a cat, right? And I want to adopt that cat. Well, I might do so and think, oh, look, I've done such a good thing. I've given this cat a nice home, and, I've acted benevolently, right? Not for selfish reasons at all, because, hey, it's going to take a lot of time to care for the cat. Sometimes the cat could be annoying, and maybe I have to pay for medical bills and so on, right? But what egoism is going to say is what you really did was look at that cat, you pitied the cat, and you adopted the cat because you wanted to stop that feeling of pity from occurring. Or perhaps you wanted to look good among others, that, hey, look at this nice act I did. So it increases perhaps your fame or your good standing among others, right? Now, all this is unbeknown to you. Mengzi, on the other hand, though, what he says is that this is wrong, okay? Now, maybe some humans do act selfishly, but we're not predisposed to act selfishly. He says, the reason why I say that all humans have hearts that are not unfeeling toward others is this. Suppose someone suddenly saw a child about to fall into a well. Anyone in such a situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion, not because one sought to get in good with the children's parents, not because one wanted fame among one's neighbors and friends, and not because one would dislike the sound of the child's cries. So the reason given is that if you see a child about to fall into the well, you're going to have this ability to put yourself in the shoes of the other person, right? So you're going to have empathy. All human beings have empathy. If not, they're not a human being, according to Mengzi. Well, because all human beings have empathy, we all have a certain inclination to put ourselves in the position of that child, that's maybe about to fall into the well. And we could think, that would be like a really terrible feeling. And so we're able to display a sense of compassion for the other person, right? Without actually, having to think about what we would want to do. Now, of course, we think we wouldn't want to fall in the well, but we're not going to do it because, we don't want to have to go through that grief. We do it because it's the right thing to do. So there's this this natural sense of morality, a sense of what is the right thing to do, morally speaking, to display benevolence towards others, right? And in this way, Mengzi thinks egoism is wrong. Now, even though human beings have this, natural predisposition for benevolence, this has to be nurtured. So Mengzi thinks that all human beings have what he calls sprouts of virtue that need to be nurtured. So this is why we need qi. We need a certain kind of qi that provides, for example, moral education in order to know the difference between right and wrong, in order to facilitate and encourage, right, the development of habits or dispositions, and ultimately, right, just a certain a being of virtue that people then naturally act on. So he says, the feeling of compassion is the sprout of benevolence. The feeling of disdain is the sprout of righteousness. The feeling of deference is the sprout of propriety. The feeling of approval and disapproval is the sprout of wisdom. So what we can do is we can look to certain feelings we have as a kind of sign that tells us what we, what we should do in a certain situation. So if I have a sense of compassion, right, or I develop this, right, this sense of compassion for the child, right, that's about to fall in the well, that should be a sign to me that, hey, I need to act benevolently towards the child and go save them. If I have a feeling of disdain, then I need to think, hey, then I should act out of a sense of justice and maybe, stop this crime from being committed that I have disdain for. Or maybe I have this sense that I should, defer to someone else of authority because, they're better able to tell me what to do in this specific situation. In this case, right, this is the feeling of deference where I can cultivate a sense of propriety, right, of doing what is right out of a sense of obligation. And if I have a sense of a feeling of approval or disapproval, right, then I'm inclined to maybe follow something or not follow it, that is the sprout of wisdom. So here then are these four virtues: benevolence, wisdom, propriety, and righteousness. So benevolence is the virtue of being human to one another, treating them like a human being in the way that we would want to be treated. Now, it's not exactly the golden rule, right? Treat others as you would want to be treated, but it's a way in which you recognize I'm a human being, you're a human being. I have to treat you not as a mere means, right? But as a fellow human being. I have to treat you as someone who is deserving, right? Maybe of respect, according to the role you might occupy in society or in relation to myself, and so on. Wisdom, right, is a certain virtue where it is knowledge that enables you to behave in a benevolent way, or in a proprietary way, or in the way of righteousness. Propriety is the virtue of following customary ritual practices or following one's duty. So perhaps I'm a ruler. I should think of myself as a ruler first and not as something else because I have other people that rely on me, right? I have a certain obligation to meet the needs of my subjects. Or maybe I'm a father, okay? I have a certain duty to look after my child, right? Before looking after my friend or before looking after a stranger. Right? And in this way, sometimes then I have to defer to certain people. Maybe I defer to the ruler, but I don't defer to the child in terms of authority. Righteousness or justice is the virtue of complying then with moral obligations and seeking then to punish those, of course, right, that don't comply with moral obligations or the obligations of the state, right? So then you would carry out justice by punishing them or rewarding people as well. Now, the virtue ethics of Confucianism as articulated here by Mengzi, what's important, and we've already got a sense of this based on, for example, the virtue of duty, is that one should think of the obligations towards others as a kind of web that extends out from oneself. So one should, just as a normal person, think of their family members, right? Their children, their spouse, their parents, their siblings, right? One has the greatest obligation to them first. Then, of course, one has an obligation to friends, and then, of course, to strangers. So whereas a philosophy like Buddhism might argue that one should display benevolence to all persons, no matter what, right? Regardless of who they are, because since there's no self, there's no, one suffering to privilege over someone else. Here, what Confucian virtue ethics, as articulated by Mengzi, is saying is that you should first actually you should seek to alleviate the suffering, of course, of your child or your spouse and so on before you do that of your friends, and seek to alleviate the suffering of your friends before you seek to alleviate the suffering of strangers and so on, right? Now, this also occurs between ruler and their subjects. So a ruler should have empathy, establish empathy between themselves and their subjects, right? And this is why a ruler should govern according to the virtue of benevolence and righteousness, and not merely to what is profitable to themselves as a ruler. So Mengzi responded, "In former times Duke Liu of Zhou was fond of wealth. As the odes say, they stacked, they stored, bundles up dried goods, in bags and sacks, thinking to gather together and bring glory. His bows and arrows were displayed, with shields, spears, and battle axes. He commenced the march against Ben. Hence, those who stayed at home had loaded granaries, and those who marched had full provisions. Only then could they commence the march. If your majesty is fond of wealth, but treats the commoners the same, what difficulty is there in becoming a king?" Right? So he's saying it's okay if, as a ruler, you're fond of wealth. If you say, I shouldn't only think about, making myself rich, I should think about also making society rich, right? My people rich. And in so doing, if then I make myself rich, nobody's going to hate me for that. In fact, they might actually have a greater sense of loyalty to me, because I've also, in the process of making myself rich, sought to make them rich as well. So in this way, again, right, the ruler seeks to extend benevolence to their subjects as well, and to look for their well-being as well, because the position they occupy says that they have a certain obligation to look for their well-being. Now, morally speaking, as individuals, this really requires, at an early age, moral education, right? This is why family is so important. And, ultimately, this is why customs are so important in Confucianism, because you have to have an established structure in society, established roles of authority, right, that are able to then, people can defer to them, right, who of course have maybe more wisdom, like a parent that is trying to teach a child the difference between right and wrong. And the way that moral education should work then, right, is to start with our natural impulses, to look at them again as a kind of sign through extension. So you start with one's family and then you extend outward, right? Benevolence is a virtue, but one should be more benevolent towards one's family than they should be towards others, and so on. Now, a ruler is a bit different because of course, the position they occupy is different from a mere subject, right? The ruler's first obligation is towards citizens and then their family. As where a parent that maybe is just a farmer, their first obligation is towards their family, and then it's towards maybe, the other citizens that they live with, right, in that society. Now, of course, as a ruler, this requires, again, recognizing economic and social causes of misdeeds. So in the same way that an individual needs to seek to cultivate good qi, so the ruler needs to seek to cultivate good qi for the society, focusing on the economic and social causes of misdeeds, such that, with this example that Mengzi was giving here from this poem, before the king sought out to go on a pillaging expedition, right, he ensured that his subjects as a whole had food, that they were well taken care of before he goes out to then pillage another kingdom to make himself and his soldiers rich. In that way, right, he ensured he was taking care of his subjects first before looking for his own needs. And in this way, he recognized, look, if I don't, care about the fact that if I leave, what if there's an economic downturn? Well, I need stocks of grain and so on. And if I have stocks of grain, then if there's a downturn, it's less likely that there's going to be chaos while I'm gone out on this, maybe pillaging expedition. So one needs to behave in accordance with responsibilities that pertain to one's role, right? This sense of one's role is extremely important here. If one does that, then others are obligated to treat you as becomes your role. So, in the case of for example, the Bhagavad Gita in Hinduism, what is morally correct pertains to one's role insofar as it pertains to the structure of the caste system in general. Now, this is a bit different, okay? So it's not the kind of deontology of the ethics of the Bhagavad Gita, which says something is right in and of itself, and following one's caste duty is what is right. Here it's saying you follow your role because it's the best way to flourish in the virtues. It's the best way to be benevolent. It's the best way to practice justice. It's the best way to follow one's duty, right? And because of this, right, then one will have cultivated the virtue of wisdom, because one will recognize that the best thing to do is to follow one's role for that sake. And this can mean different things as well, so it's not the case that, like in the Bhagavad Gita, maybe you should go and kill your own family because you have to follow your caste duty. I mean, here in this case, Confucianism, as articulated by Mengzi, is saying you should never go and kill your own family for the sake of some ruler because, it's the concern of the larger society. Your first responsibility is to your family, again, unless, for example, you're a ruler. So there are these differences here between, for example, the deontology of Hinduism and the Bhagavad Gita, and, of course, the rule consequentialism of Buddhism. Now, finally, we should see the virtues as being unified, right? So the virtues are unified insofar as wisdom, propriety, and righteousness are all manifestations of benevolence. So Mengzi says, now, benevolence is heaven's rank of respect and people's abode of peace. If one is not benevolent, though nothing prevents it, this is to fail to be wise. If one fails to be benevolent and fails to be wise in this case. So, if one is not benevolent and one is not wise, then one lacks propriety and righteousness. This is to be the lackey of other people then, right? So where, even though you might have a sense of authority, you're not actually acting out your responsibilities as an authority figure, and so other people don't respect you, and maybe they boss you around, right? Then we have a breakdown of the social order, a cultivation of bad chi. To be the lackey of other people, yet to be ashamed of being a lackey then, is like being a bow maker, yet ashamed of making bows, or to be an arrow maker, yet ashamed of making arrows. So the idea is here, if one is benevolent, okay, and one has cultivated their chi such that they can be benevolent, and yet they choose not to act on this, is because they haven't cultivated the virtue of wisdom. They haven't cultivated the virtue of wisdom. They don't know how to see, again, the signs that might tell them, in this situation, right, I need to be benevolent to such and such person. If that's the case, then they don't know that they should, that they have a certain duty to follow the obligations that are the role they occupy, maybe as a father again, or an employee, or a student, or whatever else, right? And if this is the case, well then of course they're not going to be carrying out justice, they're going to be violating justice, because they're not going to be giving to people what they are owed by their, maybe rank in society, or their relationship to you. Maybe you are not responding to a friend as you should, because you don't have the wisdom to see how you should be acting. All of these, again, all of these are manifestations of benevolence because we should all treat others as human beings. And I think that we can see how this, comes full circle back to that first argument Mengzi made about the ruler. If one truly cares about consequences above all else, Mengzi argues here, right? One should focus on flourishing in the virtues, and then good consequences or profit will come. To merely focus on one's consequences then is to neglect the other essential components required for flourishing, like, for example, righteousness or propriety, wisdom, and ultimately benevolence.